The Pacific Fur Company was an American fur trade venture wholly owned and funded by John Jacob Astor that functioned from 1810 to 1813. It was based in the Oregon Country, a region of the Pacific Northwest contested between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the Spanish Empire, the United States of America, and the Russian Empire. Astor planned for several companies planned to function across the Great Lakes, the Great Plains, and the Oregon Country to gain control of the North American fur trade. Comparatively inexpensive manufactured goods were to be shipped to commercial stations for trade with various indigenous nations for fur pelts. The sizable number of furs collected would then be brought to the port of Guangzhou, as pelts were in high demand in the Qing Empire. Chinese products would in turn be purchased for resale throughout Europe and the United States. A beneficial agreement with the Russian American Company was also planned through the regular supply of provisions for posts in Russian America. This was planned in part to prevent the rival Montreal-based Northwest Company to gain a presence along the Pacific coast, a prospect neither Russian colonial authorities or Astor favored. Management, clerks and fur trappers were sent both by land and by sea to the Pacific coast in the autumn of 1810. The base of operations was constructed at the mouth of the Columbia River in 1811. Fort Astoria, the destruction of the company vessel the Tonquin later that year off the shore of Vancouver Island, took with it the majority of the annual trading goods. Commercial competition with the NWC began soon after the foundation of Fort Astoria. The Canadian competitors maintained several stations in the interior, primarily Spokane House, Kootenai House and Salish House. Fort Okanagan was also opened in 1811, the first of several PFC posts created to counter these locations. The overland expedition faced military hostilities from several indigenous cultures and later had an acute provision crisis leading to starvation. Despite losing men crossing the Great Plains and later at the Snake River, they arrived in groups throughout January and February 1812 at Fort Astoria. The lack of military protection during the War of 1812 forced the sale of PFC assets to the NWC, while the transactions were not finalized until 1814 due to the distance from Fort Astoria to Montreal and New York City. The company was functionally defunct by 1813. A party of Astorians returning overland to St. Louis in 1813 made the important discovery of the South Pass through the Rocky Mountains. This geographic feature would later be used by hundreds of thousands of settlers traveling over the Oregon, California, and Mormon routes, collectively called the Westward expansion trails. The emporium envisioned by Astor was a failure for a number of reasons, including the loss of 2 supply ships, the material difficulties of crossing the North American continent, and competition from the Northwest Company. Historian Arthur S. Morton concluded that the misfortunes which befell the Pacific Fur Company were great, but such as might be expected at the initiation of an enterprise in a distant land whose difficulties and whose problems lay beyond the experience of the traders. Background. Origin. Prior to John Jacob Astor creating his bold enterprise in the Oregon Country, European descendants throughout previous decades had suggested creating trade stations along the Pacific coast. Peter Pond, an active American fur trader, offered maps of his explorations in modern Alberta, Saskatchewan and the Northwest Territories to both the United States Congress and to Henry Hamilton, Lieutenant Governor of Quebec in 1785. While it has been conjectured that Pond wanted funding from the Americans to explore the Pacific coast for the Northwest Passage, there is no documentation of this, and it is more likely that he had sent a copy of the map to Congress due to personal pride. Pond later became a founding member of the Northwest Company and would continue to trade in modern Alberta. In time, Pond would have an influence upon Alexander Mackenzie, who later famously crossed the North American continent. Mackenzie would in 1802 promote a plan formed the Fishery and Fur Company to the British government. In it he called for a supreme civil and amp military establishment on Mckay Island, with 2 additional posts located on the Columbia River and another in the Alexander Archipelago. Additionally, this plan was formed to bypass the 3 major British monopolies at the time: the Hudson's Bay Company, the South Sea Company and the East India Company, for access to the Chinese markets. However, the British government ignored the plan, leaving the NWC to pursue Mackenzie's plans alone. Another likely influence upon Astor would be a long friend, Alexander Henry. At times Henry would muse at the potential of the western coast, forming establishments on the Pacific shoreline to harness the economic potential. Would be my favorite plan, as Henry described in a letter to a New York merchant. It is likely that these considerations were discussed with Astor during his visits to Montreal and the Beaver Club. Despite not originating the idea to create a venture on the Pacific coast, Astor's ability to combine and use the ideas of other men would push him forward to pursue the idea. Formation: Astor began to court diplomatic and government support of a fur trading venture to be established on the Pacific shore in 1808. In correspondence with the mayor of New York City, DeWitt Clinton, Astor explained that a state charter would offer a particular level of formal sanction needed in the venture. President Thomas Jefferson was soon contacted by the ambitious merchant as well. Astor gave a detailed plan of his mercantile considerations, declaring that they were designed to bring about American commercial dominance over the greater part of the fur trade of this continent. He in turn requested the federal government grant his operations military support to defend against British citizens and control these new markets. The bold proposals were not given official sanction, however, making Astor to continue to promote his ideas among prominent governmental agents. During this time, Astor formally began his American Fur Company, a lasting trading concern based in the modern Midwestern America, to create a chain of trading stations spread across the Pacific Northwest to the Rocky Mountains. He incorporated an AFC subsidiary, the Pacific Fur Company. The commercial venture was originally designed to last for 20 years. Unlike its major competitor, the Canadian-owned NWC, the Pacific Fur Company was not a joint stock company. Capital for the PFC amounted to $200,000 divided into 100 shares individually valued at $2,000 and was funded entirely by Astor. The American Fur Company held half of the stock and the other half divided among prospective management and clerks. The chief representative of Astor in the daily operations was Wilson Price Hunt, a Street Louis businessman with no outback experience, who received 5 shares. Each working partner was assigned 4 shares, with the remaining shares held in reserve for hired clerks. Fellow partners in the venture were recruited from the NWC, the members being Alexander Mckay, Duncan McDougall, and Donald Mackenzie. Astor and the partners met in New York on the 23rd of June 1810 to sign the Pacific Fur Company's Provisional Agreement, to establish the fledgling PFC trade posts in the distant Oregon country. Astor's plan called for an extensive movement of large groups of employees overland following the route of the Lewis and Clark expedition and navally by sailing around Cape Horn. The venture was planned on methods used in the AFC for the collection of fur pelts. Complements of employees would operate in various parts of the region to complete trapping excursions. Outposts maintained by the PFC would be freighted necessary foodstuffs and supplies by annual cargo ships from New York City. Trade goods for the Pacific Northwest Indigenous such as beads and blankets would be exchanged for fur pelts. Ongoing supply issues faced by the Russian-American company were seen as a means to gain more furs. Cargo ships en route from the Columbia were planned to then sail north for Russian America to bring much-needed provisions. By cooperating with Russian colonial authorities to strengthen the material presence in Russian America, it was hoped by Astor to stop the NWC or any other British presence to be established upon the Pacific coast. A tentative agreement for merchant vessels owned by Astor to ship furs gathered in Russian America into the Qing Empire was signed in 1812. Company ships then were directed to sail to the port of Guangzhou, where furs were then sold for impressive profits. Chinese products like porcelain, nankeens and tea were to be purchased with the ships then to cross the Indian Ocean and head for European and American markets to sell the Chinese wares. Labor recruitment. The PFC required a sizable number of laborers, fur trappers and in particular voyages to staff company locations. Recruiting for the company's two expeditions were led by Wilson Hunt and Donald Mackenzie for the Overland Party and Alexander Mckay for the naval-bound group. All three men were based out of Montreal throughout May to July 1810. Hunt was designated to lead the overland expedition. Despite his inexperience in dealing with indigenous cultures, or residing in the wilderness, it was suggested that Hunt instead trade positions with Mckay and travel on the Tonquin. However, it was determined to keep Hunt in charge of the land party. The customary time for free agents to be sent into the interior from Montreal was in May, leaving few men left in the city available for hire. The recruitment effort stalled in part from the bitter treatment by the NWC and Hunt's lack of prior experience as a fur merchant, the source of many issues later on. PFC contracts were atypically favorable for hired men when compared to its Montreal competitors. Terms included a 40% larger annual salary, double the cash advanced prior to departure, and a length of service lasting 5 years, rather than the more common 2 or 3-year employment. Mckay's efforts during the summer of 1810. Alexander Mckay hired 13 French Canadians for the Tonquin. The majority of the group remained in Montreal until late July, when they given directives to withdraw to New York City. A canoe provided transportation for the trip down the Richelieu River and Lake Champlain. At Whitehall, additional men that were employed by Mckay joined the southbound party, among them Ovid de Montigny. On the 3rd of August they reached New York City, with the group's hats decorated with party-colored ribands and feathers, causing some Americans to believe them to natives. The following day lodgings at Long Island were reached and the scene was described by Clark Gabriel Franchier. "We sang as we rode," which joined to the unusual sight of a birch bark canoe impelled by 9 stout Canadians, dark as Indians, and as gaily adorned, attracted a crowd upon the wharves to gaze at us as we glided along. While waiting to depart for the Pacific, Mckay met with British diplomatic official Francis James Jackson. The official assured Mckay that in the event of war between the United States and United Kingdom, all PFC employees that were British employees would be treated as such. Hunt's efforts. 13 men signed contracts in Montreal to join Hunt on the journey to the Pacific coast by land. Notably, only one had previously operated under a contract lasting longer than a year. The generous cash advancements were taken advantage by 3 men who deserted before Hunt and the remaining group left the city for Mackinac In July, the party reached Mackinac Island on the 28th of July 1810. Acting as a major depot for the regional Great Lakes fur trade, the island was where Hunt focused on hiring more men for the company. The veteran fur merchant Ramsay Crooks was convinced to join the company and assisted in recruiting additional men. Over the 16 days spent there, a total 17 men were recruited to the concern, with 16 being French-Canadian. This group of men, unlike those hired in Montreal, had extensive experience working in the fur trade as voyagers and other roles, likely suggested by Crooks. Interested men already hired by other companies would have the contracts purchased from their employers. After the men were finally gathered in early August, Hunt and the party departed for St. Louis and arrived there on the 3rd of September. The hired voyagers and fur trappers completed many transactions with various merchants in St. Louis and in the nearby French-Canadian settlement of St. Genevieve throughout September and October. These were recorded on the company ledger, and particular purchases been argued as the men collecting goods to trade with various indigenous nations they would visit. In particular, these negotiations by the French Canadians have been thought to be steps towards later establishing themselves as independent traders in relatively unexploited fur regions. Most of the men in the overland party were engaged as hunters, interpreters, guides and voyagers. Oceanic component. The advanced party was sent to create the initial base of operations at the mouth of the Columbia River. Necessary trade goods for deals with Indigenous and needed supplies to establish the station were shipped on the same vessel in addition to beginning the company headquarters. This party would block any attempts by the NWC to create a station in the area. The ship Tonquin was purchased by Astor in 1810 to start commercial operations on the Pacific Ocean. The majority of the company partners, Duncan McDougall, David and Robert Stewart, and Alexander Mckay, would head this detachment. In addition, Clark's Gabriel Franchier and Alexander Ross would join them on the planned voyage. The Tonquin, under the command of Jonathan Thorne. The Tonquin left New York on September 8, 1810. PFC employees numbered 33 men in total on board. The vessel landed at the Falkland Islands on the 4th of December to make repairs and take on water supplies at Port Egmont. Captain Thorne attempted to abandon 8 of the crew still on shore, among them Clark's Gabriel Franchier and Alexander Ross. The stranded men were taken on board after Robert Stewart threatened to kill Thorne. Communication between company workers was no longer held in English to keep the captain excluded from discussions. Company partners held talks in their ancestral Scottish Gaelic and the labourers used Canadian French. On December 25 the Tonquin rounded Cape Horn and sailed north into the Pacific Ocean. The ship anchored at the Kingdom of Hawaii in February 1811. Due to the possibility of men abandoning the posts to live in the tropical islands, Thorne assembled all of the crew and PFC employees to harass them to remain on the ship. Commercial transactions with Hawaiians saw the crew purchasing cabbage, sugar cane, purple yams, taro, coconuts, watermelon, breadfruit, hogs, goats, 2 sheep, and poultry in return for glass beads, iron rings, needles, cotton cloth. Upon entering Honolulu, the crew was greeted by Isaac Davis and Francisco de Paula Marin, the latter acting an interpreter in negotiations with Kamehameha I and prominent government official Kalani Moku. 24 native Hawaiian kanakas were hired with the approval of Kamehameha I, who appointed Mckay to oversee their interests. The Columbia River was reached in March 1811. Despite stormy conditions, over several days Thorne ordered 2 boats dispatched to scout a safe route over the treacherous Columbia Bar. Both boats would capsize and 8 men lost their lives. Finally, on March 24, the Tonquin crossed the bar, passing into the Columbia's estuary and laid anchor in Baker's Bay. Captain Thorne stressed the urgency for the Tonquin to start trading further north along the Pacific coast as instructed by Astor. After 65 days on the Columbia River, the Tonquin departed with a crew of 23 with Mckay was aboard the ship as supercargo. At Vancouver Island she was boarded by the Tlaokiaht people of Clayoco Sound, where Thorne caused an uproar by hitting a Tlaokiaht noble with a pelt. In the ensuing conflict, all of men brought on the Tonquin were killed besides an interpreter from the Quinault nation, and the ship was destroyed. This put the occupants of Fort Astoria in a tough position, having no access to seaborne transport until the following year. Fort Astoria construction on Fort Astoria, an emporium of the West, began in the middle of April 1811. It was built upon Point George, the location being about 5 miles from the Lewis and Clark Expedition winter camp of Fort Clatsop. The terrain and thick forests made clearing a foundation exceedingly difficult. Late in the month, McDougall reported that there was little progress in clearing, the place being so full of half-decayed trunks, large fallen timber and amped thick brush. No one among the party had previous experience in the logging industry, and any hadn't used an axe before. In general, trees had a layer of hardened resin and were of a massive size. 4 men worked as a team on platforms at least 8 feet above the ground to effectively cut a tree, with it taking typically 2 days for a single tree to be felled. Medical issues quickly became another major issue for the party, as there was not a single medical officer among the passengers brought on the Tonquin. This left treatments rudimentary at best. During the initial months on the Columbia River, at any time upwards of half of the expedition was unable to perform manual labor due to illness. Ka'umanupika, a Two-Spirit, and his wife arrived at Fort Astoria on the 15th of June 1811 with a letter from John Stewart. Ka'uma offered accounts of the interior and his essential service, provided intelligence to encourage a post be erected among the Silx nation. It was determined that David Stewart would take a party with Ka'uma to the Silx. Before they left, however, the inhabitants of Astoria were surprised by the arrival of David Thompson on the 15th of July. Thompson later stated that his group set off on a voyage down the Columbia River to explore this river in order to open out a passage for the interior trade with the Pacific Ocean. The competing fur traders were cordially received at Astoria. Fort Okanagan, a party of 10 led by David Stewart, departed on the 22nd of July for the Silx territories. It was composed of 5 French Canadians, 2 Hawaiians, and a Scotchman, along with Ka'umanupika and his wife. The group joined David Thompson and his 8 men in traveling up the Columbia, staying together until the Dallas. Upon entering Cascade Chinookan territory, Stewart failed to establish favorable relations with them, as they showed military displays and stole a small amount of goods. Naukan agreed to join the NWC shortly after this episode, and the two parties separated. Stewart was able to secure the protection of Wasco Wishram leadership in early August. Groups of Chinookan laborers were used to cross the portages of the Columbia in the homeland. Stewart's party soon began to travel through the Sahaptin nations, and on the 12th of August an assembly of Walla Walla, Cayuse and Nez Perce welcomed the fur traders. Once the reception was complete, the PFC men continued up the Columbia and passed by the future site of Fort Nez Perce. Towards the end of August, the party began to become troubled with western rattlesnake populations and rapids, almost losing including one canoe, and the men aboard it to a section of swift currents. Stewart and his men were greeted by Wenatchee leadership at the Wenatchee River, who gave 2 horses to the fur traders as a gift, in addition to several more being purchased. While passing through other indigenous homelands, the PFC continued financial dealings for food supplies. Members of the Chelan Nation traded some salmon, fruits, and berries, and later Methows offered their abundance of salmon and many horses to the fur trappers for sale. While at the junction of the Columbia and Okanagan River, a large encampment of Sioux were encountered. Prominent members of the nation entreated the fur traders to reside among the people, proclaiming themselves to always be our friends, to kill us plenty of beavers, to furnish us at all times with provisions, and to ensure our protection and safety. The cargo of the canoes were taken to land on the 1st of September, and work soon began on Fort Okanagan, a residence crafted from driftwood acquired from the Okanagan River. While construction of the post was ongoing, 4 men that included Pillay were detailed to inform the progress of inland trade. The party arrived back at the company headquarters on the 11th of October and gave its favorable report. Stewart led Montagny and 2 other men to follow the course of the Okanagan, leaving only Ross at the post. As promised, the Sioux provided security for the station, frequently alerting Ross when intruders from other nations came near. Despite planning on exploring the Okanagan watershed for a month, Stewart and his 3 men did not return until the 22nd of March 1812. Upon reaching the Okanagan headwaters, the party then went over to the Thompson River. Snows in mountain passes made it exceedingly difficult for the party to travel. Detained among the Sequepech, Stewart developed cordial relations with them. Finding their areas rich in beaver populations, he promised to return later that year to create a trading post.